I think it's on. Hey. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had enough to eat down there. Wonderful to see all of you here. My name is Don Presley. I'm on the leadership team of MRC, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here. And our people who are viewing online. We are streaming at this point. Yay! So, all right. I want to thank the folks from Spirit of Hope for hosting our gathering. And there were many parts, some big, some small, to make this event happen. And so thank you to Luke and Susan Williams in the box. And hopefully it'll all go good. Gloria Peck and her entire team of hospitality downstairs. Yay! Thank you. And as I said, Susan Williams, our tech lead. And for those of you that didn't know, Spirit of Hope suffered a lightning strike about a week and a half ago. Yeah. So we're still dealing with lightning gremlins. So if you see a screen flash a little bit, it's not God trying to reach out to us. It's lightning. So anyway, just want to say a couple of things of upcoming events. In no particular order, but they are falling that way. Minnesota Annual Conference is May 31st and June 1st in St. Cloud at the River's Edge Convention Center. So we plan to have a strong presence there. We hope to have a table. Is that right, Judy? We hope so. I think the MRC will get some more information out on that too for that. We are registered once again for the Pride Fest, and yeah, so we're in. Same booth location. I don't know who our neighbors are again this year, so we'll just find that out when we get there. We have our peace medallions are here. I think it was 20,000 we ordered this year. We had 12 last year, ran out. So we have more here, and that's wonderful. And we are also registered for the Pride March. So 2 separate entities, same weekend. If you haven't heard, the Pride Festival this year is falling on Taylor Swift weekend in the Twin Cities. They are expecting 450 to 500,000 people at the Pride Fest. That's what they're anticipating, so it's going to be an exciting time. Max Richter, Pastor Max, and Tyler Sitt are going to be working on organizing the March group. And it's in good hands. So we also have an upcoming event possibly at the fair at the Hamlin Dining Hall where the MRC group could staff shifts for one day. All of that is being worked on. We're getting the particulars taken care of, but we'll find out a day and get word out to you for signing up for a shift. And again, you'll hear more about that. Our next our MRC meeting is Thursday, May 11th, and anyone is welcome to be on those meetings, and they're all on Zoom, and it's just a great time to see other faces from MRC congregations. I would invite you to join them. You'll hear what's going on. You'll hear what the needs are right away, where you might want to step in. We can always use the extra hands and feet and hearts and minds. So if you would be interested in that, that would be wonderful. I want to say welcome to our newest Reconciling congregation, and that is Holy Trinity in Prior Lake. I think do we have Holy Trinity folks here? I thought we were going to have a few that, well, welcome. My wife Karen and I had the privilege of going down there and talking to them about what it was like to become a reconciling congregation where we attend. And Holy Trinity took their vote. It was nearly unanimous, so we're so happy for that church. And finally, the Reconciling Ministries Network is holding their annual or national convocation in October. It's in Charlotte, North Carolina. It is a huge event, as Judy Jurdy shared with me. If you've never been there, you really could try to make an effort to go down there. It's an amazing experience. So you can find out more about that. RMN, they're out there. You can find out more about that. With that, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, give you a little bit of background. Austen Hartke is the author of Transforming the Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians. It's a book on theology and personal narratives published by Westminster John Knox Press. He is also the founder and executive director of Transmission Ministry Collective, correct? An online community dedicated to the spiritual care, faith formation, and leadership potential of transgender and gender-expansive Christians. Austen's a graduate of Luther Seminary's Master of Arts program in Old Testament Hebrew Bible studies. As a transgender person of faith, Austen's greatest passion is helping other trans and gender-expansive people see themselves in Scripture. And with that, there will be a time of Q&A afterwards. And now, with that, would you please welcome Austen Hartke.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here with you all today. I'm excited to be, I got invited to come speak to you all, and I thought, oh, this is my favorite type of group to go speak to, is folks that are like already on board and just want to know what to do. I don't have to convince you, right? So I'm very excited to be here with you all today. We are going to go through a whole bunch of different things this afternoon, almost said morning. And so we're going to talk a little bit about my story. We're going to talk a little bit about gender and the language we use around gender. I always find that it's better to not assume that people know things and give you a little bit of background on the language that I'm going to be using before we get into anything else. Just so if you're like, I already know all this, Austen, bear with me. We don't want to leave anybody behind. So we'll talk a little bit about gender language, and then we'll talk a bit about what some concrete actions. What are things that we can do as communities, as individuals, to support transgender folks, especially right now when trans folks are really in the crosshairs, sort of culturally, socially, and legislatively, right? So even though we're here in Minnesota and we just passed the trans refuge bill, yay. Very, very, very important, but it's definitely not the end of the road, right? There's a lot more stuff to do. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start out with our first slide here, or possibly second. Here's our first slide. We're going to start with our second slide. That specifically gives you a little bit of a background on my story. So these are photos of me as a young person, and to give you a little bit of a background about where I am and where I came from. I grew up the oldest of what everybody thought was 3 girls, and so I was assigned female at birth, and it took me a long time to figure out how to explain to people that that wasn't right. So you can see me, I'm all the way on the left hand there with me and my sisters. And the photo in the middle is one that I can look at now, and I still go, oh yeah, that's me. Like, I can look at that photo and see myself in it. That's me about 9 years old playing baseball. And so to give you a sense of like the kind of childhood that I grew up in an evangelical, non-denominational homeschooling family. So it was kind of a culturally insular experience, not to the extreme, but definitely to an extent. And so my experience growing up was very Bible-based, like being a homeschooled kid within that context. You know, I was practicing my handwriting by writing out Psalms. So like, this is the kind of schooling that I had growing up. And there was a sense of what was expected in terms of gender for me, there was a little bit of wiggle room in the gender expectations because, as my mom always said, well, your grandma was a tomboy and she grew out of it, so you will too, right? So that was the expectation, was like, you know, your grandma was a little bit like this, so we're not going to be totally mad about it, but eventually there's going to be a point where this is going to be a problem. And so there was that sense of like, you know, a little bit of wiggle room now, not so much later. Growing up understanding a sort of conservative Christian, evangelical understanding of what it is to be a Christian man or a Christian woman. Like, you know, my dad went to Promise Keepers meetings, if you're familiar with them. Like, the sense of like gender as a part of your faith life was very much a thing. So, growing up, I had this sense that like something wasn't quite right, but I didn't really know what it was, and I didn't have the language for it. So I didn't really feel like I had any kind of gender until I was about 10 or 11 when puberty started hitting, and that was the point at which I was like, oh ho, something has gone terribly wrong. And my experience of my gender as a teenager was push and pull between how do I fit in and not, get bullied and try to be what people want me to be, and how do I be myself, right? Always that push and pull. And I think that's a push and pull everybody experiences in high school, right? That's not unique to trans folks, but it might be unique in terms of some of the gender expectations and how we think about our gender. So the last photo on that slide, the one on the right hand, is me in high school. And there was the sort of folks that I ended up finding myself gravitating to in high school were all the goth kids. And it was specifically because there was more room for different kinds of gender expression within that sort of subgroup. And so I was like, oh, okay, I can be a little bit different, right? This photo on the right, you probably can't see very well, but my fingernails are painted black. And it was because at the time, all the boys in sort of my goth group were all painting their fingernails black. It was like this thing about like boys painting their fingernails, so rebellious, right? But they only did it black because like that was the cool thing for boys to do, right? So like we can't get too wild with gender and expression. And so for me, I was like, this is perfect because I can do something that's expected of me as somebody who everybody thinks is a girl. I can paint my nails, but I can do it in a boy way. So this was my experience of gender kind of coming up, trying to figure out language for who I was. On the next slide, we've got some pictures of me growing up, going through college. The photo on the left-hand side is me and my now fiance. We've been together for 11 years now, and we're getting married in September, which I'm very excited about. My experience of going through college was one of still trying to figure out how to be myself, still trying to find the language. It was then that I started in college finding more language around trans identities and figuring out like, oh, there's a name for this. There's language for this, and I didn't have access to that language before. So it took me a long time to kind of find out that trans people existed, and then realize, oh, that's what that's called, right? So it took me a little while. At the same time, I was struggling with my faith journey because as a teenager, my experience was one of really pushing back against the faith tradition that I'd grown up in. Especially realizing as I was in high school and figuring out more about myself and more about the people I cared about, really seeing that pushback from the conservative evangelical Christian worldview I grew up in against LGBT people, right? And that was the first moment when I was like, so we're told that God loves everybody, but there's like 18 asterisks after that, right? And that didn't make sense to me. And I started pushing back against a lot of the specific pressures around sexuality, especially as I was realizing that I myself was like part of the LGBT community. I was realizing that I identified as bisexual, and so that was my sort of introduction to this community, was going, oh, okay, there's something different about my orientation. And for a long time, I thought that was the answer. That's all it was, is like, oh, well, I'm bi. And there's a lot more wiggle room for gender expression for gay and lesbian and bisexual people. So I was like, okay, that's the answer. I've got that figured out. Turns out there was a whole other segment there around gender that I hadn't figured out. But so I was pushing back against the sort of faith tradition that I had grown up in and thinking about the ways that it seemed like we weren't walking the talk. And I felt frustrated by that. And so for a long time I thought, I don't think maybe I don't want to be a Christian. Maybe I don't believe any of this stuff anymore. And it took me a long time of pushing back and walking away to try to figure out that there actually was something about Christianity that still called to me. And so when I talk about my relationship with God specifically, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the children's book, The Runaway Bunny. Yes, okay. So at least some of you, it's a board book, a young kid's book, and it's a story about a baby bunny who says he's going to run away from home, and everywhere he goes, his mom is like, well, I'm going to be there. So the baby bunny says, I'm going to be a sailor, I'm going to sail away on the sea, and the mama bunny says, like, well, I'm going to be the wind that's like filling your sails, right? all this sort of thing all the way through the book. And that was my relationship with God throughout my like teenage and young adult years, was me going, God, I'm going over there. And God being like, okay, well, I'm coming with you. So whenever you want to notice me, I'll be here, right? And that was this sort of pull back toward God and realizing that there were things that I really valued about Christianity. When we talk about theology related to embodiment and incarnation, when we talk about reconciliation, when we talk about the intricate dance that is the Trinity, right? There were things about Christianity that I really appreciated. And I thought, okay, then there has to be a way to learn how to make this all go together. So I went to seminary because I thought they will have all the answers. If you've been to seminary, you know that's not how that works. So I went to seminary, and I specifically went to study the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, because growing up, those were all the passages that I was hearing being thrown against, all the LGBT people I knew, including myself. Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Sodom and Gomorrah, all that stuff. I was like, well, okay, it seems like those are the problem, so I'm going to study them and try to figure them out. And the thing that I figured out fairly early was that there was something else that didn't make sense here, which is I was taught growing up, sort of maybe not explicitly, but definitely implicitly, that there was like angry Old Testament God and loving Jesus New Testament God, and that they were somehow like diametrically opposed almost, or like Jesus saved us from angry Old Testament God, and so the Old Testament didn't matter anymore except for when we want it to matter. Very confusing. And so I was like, okay, this is strange, because my Jewish friends, who only have the Hebrew scriptures, are way more affirming of LGBT people than my Christian friends are. So how does this make sense? And so I got really involved and invested in learning different interpretations between Christians and Jewish folks about those sort of clobber passages and passages in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, because I was like, this doesn't make sense. You look at these passages and you figure out ways to be affirming, and we look at the passages and say that they mean that we have to not be affirming. What's going on here? So I ended up graduating from seminary, writing my big long dissertation on one of those passages. And when I graduated, I kind of thought, okay, what do I do next? And the thing that I hadn't figured out what to do with yet was my gender. Because even when I was in seminary, I was part of our seminary's LGBT group since I was out as bisexual, but I hadn't figured out how to talk about my gender yet. And it was in those moments in seminary when I was studying these passages and going, okay, what do we do with these, that I realized that there was this like last box in the back of my closet that I hadn't wanted to touch, that was the gender box. And I realized that if I wanted to be in authentic relationship with the people around me who I was trying to create Christian community with, and if I wanted to be in a relationship with God that wasn't obstructed by the walls that I had built around myself to protect myself, I was going to need to address the stuff in this box, right? And so I came out as trans and started talking to folks about my gender in my last year of seminary, but I didn't come out at school because I wasn't sure they'd let me graduate. They'd never had an out trans person graduate from the institution yet, and so I thought, I'll just wait on this. Now that I've put all this hard work and money into this, I will wait until I graduate. So I graduated. The second to last picture on this slide, the middle picture rather, is me on graduation day, and I'm there in like a suit with my little faux hawk, and like there was, I think a lot of people knew, right, or suspected, but I didn't want to say anything until I graduated. And so once I graduated and they handed me my diploma, I said, thank you very much, I'm trans. And it turned out fine in the end. I don't know how it would have turned out had I not done it that way. Sometimes I still wish I would have done it the other way, just for the sake of bravery. But I appreciate all the folks in seminary as I was figuring that out, where I was talking with the folks around me who walked with me through a lot of those questions that I had about these passages, about what it meant to be a trans person and be a Christian. And when I graduated, I started working a job that was not anything to do with my degree, and I kind of wanted to continue doing something with the research that I had been doing specifically on gender diversity in Scripture. So I started making YouTube videos. Because transgender folks were already on YouTube documenting their transitions. This was like a huge thing in like the 2010s, where trans folks would document like week by week, like what their transition was like. And so I would start making these videos. They were like 5 minutes long that would be like, let's talk about one Bible passage or one theological point and what it's like to be a trans Christian. And I started getting so many emails back from folks saying, hey, where can I find out more about this? And my answer always ended up being, well, if you can find this musty old book in your library, or you can get behind a JSTOR paywall, I can like give you things. But there weren't accessible resources for people around trans theology. The books that did exist that were very good were out of print or super expensive or written in a very, very academic sense. And I wanted something that spoke to people where they were not really knowing much about theology at all. So in 2018, I wrote Transforming, that came out that year. And in response to Transforming, I then had another wave of people that said, this is great, I love this, I'm a trans Christian, this has helped so much. Where can I talk with other trans Christians about this? And I went, okay, now we gotta build something else new. So in 2020, March of 2020, we started Transmission Ministry Collective, which is the organization that I run now. And it is a support organization for trans Christians all online. We built it online from the start, so when COVID hit, we were already there, which was great because all the churches were like panicking. What do we do? What do we do? And we were already online. So that was really good that we got to be there when people needed us. But we have support groups for folks where people talk online in small groups about theology and about gender together. Folks from all over the country and from several other countries as well. We have Bible studies, we have workshops, all kinds of things to support folks who are figuring things out about their gender and their faith. And for folks that like kind of have their gender and faith stuff more or less figured out, but are trying to figure out how to live into that in the world. So one of my favorite groups to get to lead is our Trans People in Ministry group, which is all trans pastors. Like, it's awesome to get to talk with them once a month and like figure out how to support them in their ministry. So that's where I am today, is continuing that work with Transmission Ministry Collective and supporting folks where they're at. So now that you've got sort of a general sense of my story, I want to talk about 3 sort of big questions that I had as part of this journey, and then where that leads us to action steps. So, ooh, I have a tiny bug crawling on me. I got distracted by this little box elder bug. The 3 big questions that I had here were, what does the Bible say? Because remember, I grew up a good evangelical Christian with a lot of memorized Bible knowledge. What does it mean to be transgender? And will I be able to find a faith community that like fully welcomes and affirms me, right? Those were my big questions. So the first question, what does the Bible say? I'm not even going to go into this because I got a whole book out there. We've got this slide about the book and the things that we cover. So this is the book, and I'm not going to go into it because it's right out there for you. But if you want to think about how we deal with Genesis 1 and 2, creation stories about gender, how we talk about Deuteronomy 22:5, which is the verse about men shall not wear women's clothing and vice versa. What do we do with that? What do we do with Deuteronomy 23:1, which is a specific verse about changing reproductive organs? How does that, connect with trans Christians today? And then we've got stories of changed names, right? Acknowledgments of gender diversity and welcoming trans and gender expansive people into the church. So I bring this up to say, go read the book, but also because helping people understand the theological implications of what we're talking about and helping people understand the verses that have been, both the verses that have been used against them and verses that are supportive of them, is not necessarily something that I do because I think we need to go out there and like hit each other over the head with scripture. I don't think that's helpful, but I think that for people's own sort of edification, especially for LGBT people, we need to know how to make this make sense to ourselves. This is not so that we can like arm up and go beat other people with scripture, right? This is so that we can think, you know, like I did growing up, oh my gosh, if Genesis says God made people male and female, does that mean that I can't exist or that I'm broken or wrong somehow? We have to give people the tools to address that internally for themselves. So that's why the scripture portion of this is really, really important. So I'm going to leave the scripture portion there because that could be a whole thing on its own. Second question, what does it mean to be trans? And this is where I'm going to bring a little bit of language in for us, that this is the sort of structure that I use to explain gender. There's lots of different ways, different sort of modes or structures that you can use to explain how gender works. This is the one that I have sort of adapted from an organization called Gender Spectrum out in San Francisco that does really, really good work. So, gender. It's made up of 3 different parts that all affect each other. So your first segment here is your body, your internal and external reproductive organs, chromosomes, hormone levels, and brain matter, right? So anything to do with your body. When we think about this body segment, and you can see with the little stick figure here, we have body pointing at one very particular part of this stick figure's body. Usually all we're concerned about is external reproductive organs. And that's like anybody ever seems to care about. But the body segment is so much more complex than that. And so we'll talk a little more about that as well. The second segment is your gender identity, your internal self-perception and experience of being female, male, both, or neither. So how you understand yourself, right? We often simplify this, oversimplify this into saying sort of the body segment, or sometimes we refer to that as assigned sex, that's about what's between your legs, and gender identity is about what's in your brain, and we kind of oversimplify it that way. Which makes sense up to a point. But then when you think about the fact that, of course, your body is part of your brain and is affected by things like your hormone levels, right? It's a lot more integrated than that. In the same way that I think we get caught up in all kinds of binaries. For instance, within Christianity, we often get caught up in the binary of flesh versus spirit, right? It's very easy to get caught in those binaries, and I don't want us to get too caught in the idea of a binary between body and mind, because they are very connected. But they are disconnected in that people can make assumptions about your body and put you in a box that don't make sense for what your brain is doing, right? So the third segment is your gender expression, which is the way you show your gender to others through clothing, hair, mannerisms, voice, etc., which have gendered values in your society. And taking on specific gender roles can be part of our gender expression. So if gender identity is internal to us and nobody can see it, gender expression is how we show our gender to the world. The further complication to that, though, is that gender identity, or gender expression rather, is a way that we show our gender to the world, but it can also be something that we just play with for fun, which is why you can't make assumptions about people's gender identity based on what their gender expression is doing, right? You can't necessarily see somebody who you would assume, so take drag, for instance, right? Drag is a great example of this. Just because somebody is putting on a dress and performing a Cher song doesn't mean you can assume anything about how they understand their gender, right? So those are 2 different things. So gender expression is important to understand as being like a separate thing from gender identity. Sometimes it can tell us something. Sometimes it doesn't tell us something. So we can never make assumptions based on gender expression. So, next slide here is talking about how we sometimes hear that body part of the equation referred to as somebody's assigned sex. And this is the situation where everybody is seen either at birth or on an ultrasound ahead of birth, and they look at one part of your reproductive system, your external reproductive organs, and make assumptions about the entire rest of your body and what your brain is going to do. So you can imagine, if you're making all those assumptions, it doesn't always work out. So most people are endosex, meaning that they have sex characteristics that can be clearly assigned as either male or female, but about 1.7% of the population is intersex, meaning they have differences in sexual development. So intersex folks are, of course, part of our LGBTQ plus community, right? And so it's really important that we not leave them out of discussions when it comes to talking about things like gender. Intersex folks are, like I said, folks that have differences in sexual structure and reproductive organs and chromosomes. There's lots of different ways to be intersex. And there are intersex people who also identify as transgender because they were assigned something when they were born and maybe even had surgery without their consent when they were born, and then later realized that that doesn't actually match their gender identity, right? So there's some overlap in trans and intersex communities. But we want to be kind of specific about those differences as well. So now that we kind of have the sense of what gender looks like, the next slide talks about just some common words you're going to see, right? You're familiar with the word transgender already. Trans and cisgender being the word for people that aren't trans. Those are just Latin prefixes. Trans means across from, like transatlantic, and cis means on the same side. So whether your gender identity is on the same side as your assigned sex or whether that it's different than your assigned sex, that's what trans and cis are giving us to understand. Of course, you might meet people who are trans men, people who are trans women, and then you might meet, on the next slide here, there we go. No, wait, not quite. We had a flash. Okay, you might meet people who are non-binary, so people who have a gender identity that doesn't conform to the male-female binary, right? An agender person might not experience their gender identity at all or at a lower level than others. So if you're familiar with asexual people, agender is the same thing, but just related to gender and not related to attraction, if that makes sense. And then a genderqueer person may have a gender identity or experience that doesn't fit neatly into any category. So lots of genderqueer folks will use the word genderqueer for the same reason that a lot of people use the word queer, in that the strengths of those words are that they don't tell you anything. They are mushy, they are flexible, they are amorphous, and that is a strength for people that are like, well, you just can't pin my gender down, so it doesn't make sense for me to use a word that is more specific. Another reason somebody might use the word genderqueer is if they understand their gender as something that is not just personal, but is political, right? As something that is a calling, in a way, to disrupt the gender binaries or that sort of underpin sexism, right? And that underpin things like patriarchy. So if you meet somebody and they identify as genderqueer, you really aren't going to know what that means to them until you start to talk to them and understand them more as a person, right? So those are a couple things to be aware of. And then we sometimes use the phrase gender diversity or the descriptor gender expansive to talk about people who fall outside of gender norms in their society. And the thing that I'll say about the word gender expansive, I love that as sort of a phrase, because it talks about people whose very existence and very embodiment of gender expands our understanding of what gender can be and thereby frees the people around them as well. So gender expansive is, I think, a really wonderful phrase in that it talks about how we go about our lives in many ways, and how we can break down some of the boxes that we put each other in. It's also a really handy phrase to talk about people in the past who we can't go back and ask them about their gender identity, right? I can't go back to Joan of Arc, as much as I would love to, and be like, Joan, please tell me about your gender and what's going on with you. So we sometimes talk about people in the past. We go back and we say, this person is gender expansive. They are broadening the expectations around gender that were placed on them, right? So that can be handy in that way so that we don't act anachronistically and say, oh, look, that person was trans, because they're not going to have the same understanding of that word as we would today, right? So what does gender diversity look like today? It looks like a lot of different things. And I think when we talk about welcoming and affirming and celebrating the trans and gender expansive people in our communities, we tend to have one image of what that can look like, and it's usually either I think a lot of people either assume I'm going to see a drag queen, or they assume I'm going to see a sort of androgynous, thin white person. And that's not what everybody looks like, right? So I wanted to just give you a sense of like, okay, there's lots of different ways to be trans. There's lots of different ways that this can look. And it's important that we don't have one specific thing that we are expecting when people walk into our churches, because they're probably not going to fit our expectations anyways, because they're individuals, and all these things are helpful generalizations, but individuals are individuals, right? So the last question I had, will I be able to find a faith community, is a question that I really worried about for a long time, because it wasn't just that I wanted a community that wouldn't be mean, right? It wasn't just that I wanted a community that knew vaguely that trans people existed. I wanted a community that understood something about like gender and how gender works, and that had the curiosity and the willingness to walk alongside me as I also figured out things about my gender. So the church that I ended up going to throughout my sort of last years of seminary and then the first couple of years afterwards is a wonderful little church called Humble Walk Lutheran Church in St. Paul. And when I first started talking to my pastor there, I said, Jody, I'd really like to create some sort of remembrance of baptism and affirmation of my new name. And would you be able to like sit down with me and kind of make something for that? And she was like, absolutely. I don't really know that much, but I am willing to learn, and I'm excited to do this with you, right? And that was like good enough. I was so happy for that. And so with this little church, I worked with Jody, and I kind of put together, here's the liturgy that I kind of, have in mind, and then can you work with me on this? How do we integrate, are my parents going to be there? Do they want to be there? What's that going to be like? And we had a little ceremony, and it was amazing. The next picture is me with a cake that they made me with my new name on it, which was very nice. This is part of the prayer that they prayed. In renaming your servants Abraham, Sarah, Jacob, Peter, and Paul, you gave new lives and new tasks, new love and new hope. We now hold before you our sibling Austen. Bless him with a new measure of grace as he takes this new name. So we came up with this beautiful liturgy. It worked wonderfully. And in the years since then, because that was 2015, I believe, in the years since then, I have repeatedly had people from Humble Walk come to me and say, I still remember that day that we did your renaming ceremony. That was so memorable. That was so wonderful. And like 4 or 5 new families with trans kids have joined that church because they knew that the church already had liturgy like that ready to go, and was like happy and excited to do that with them and walk with them through those questions. So, I think a lot of us are familiar with the fact that in many of our churches, there's always there's the one sort of forerunner who's there with a machete, like hacking through the bushes, trying to be like, please, we just need to do this the first time. And then after that, everybody lines up because they're like, oh, you already have this thing? Perfect, right? And it's hard to be that first person, and I don't want to downplay that. It's hard to be the first person who's like, hey, I need this thing that doesn't exist. And it's hard for churches to do new things, right? But the more that we can prepare before we get that request, the better, because the easier it will make it for the person who's doing that first bushwhacking through, right? So let's talk about what we can do to make our churches places that people don't have to bushwhack so hard to like get the first things to happen, right? Before we go to some affirming church things, I just want to throw this map up here. This is our April anti-trans legislative risk map. This was put together by Erin Reed, who's somebody you should definitely follow. She's a trans woman who does a ton of really good work following anti-trans legislation. She made this map, and she updates it every month, I believe, now at this point, to look at essentially trans folks have asked her, what state should I move to if I need to get out of my state, right? And so she made up a map like this to kind of show what states were going to be, were at the point of passing anti-trans legislation, what states were going to be passing more helpful legislation for us. And so I bring this map because it's important for us to know, like, oh, look at us, we're nice blue Minnesota, right? Rah, rah, rah. Yes, we should be proud of that. Very good work, everyone. However, we need to be aware of the fact that both the Dakotas and Wisconsin have folks in those states that are considering moving here. And we need to be aware and prepared for when they get here, right? We also can be doing a lot to create relationships with churches in our denomination or that have any connection with us in these other states, because we don't want moving to be people's only option. Ideally, people get to stay where they have a network of support where they already are, right? But if they do have to move, what are we going to do to prepare for the folks that are moving here? So I'm actually talking with a really wonderful church right now that is starting to put together essentially like a refugee resettlement group at their church that will be like, we're going to have families sponsor trans folks that are moving here to help them with moving expenses, to have places where they can like go and talk with folks about moving to Minnesota and what that's like, introducing them to Minnesota Nice and what to watch out for. So we need to be aware of this risk map as we're continuing forward, because we need to know that folks are going to be showing up that we might not expect. So let's go to church allyship. What does church allyship look like? I'm going to throw, in the next 20 minutes or so, throw a bunch of ideas at you. And the idea is not that you do all of them, right? The idea is that I want to give you a buffet of options so that you can go, oh, our church might be able to do that, or that, or that, or that's something we'd love to do in the future, right? So don't feel overwhelmed. This is a buffet, it's not a test. So first thing we have to think about, and I think all of you probably know at this point, the importance of names and pronouns, right? So I want to bring two studies to us to emphasize why this is important. The first study is a 2018 study from the University of Texas at Austin. It found that trans youth ages 15 to 21 who had their chosen name used at school, work, home, and with friends had 71% fewer symptoms of severe depression, a 34% decrease in reported thoughts of suicide, and a 65% decrease in suicide attempts. Having even one context in which a chosen name could be used was associated with a 29% decrease in suicidal thoughts. So, what is this study telling us? Well, number one, it's telling us why this is important, right? But the second thing that I think is really important for churches to know is really focusing in on that one context, right? If you have even one context when a chosen name could be used, 29% decrease in suicidal thoughts. There are 4 context names up there, right? School, work, home, and with friends. What if church was a 5th context? What if church was the only place where your right name and pronouns got used? That matters. Even if it's nowhere else, it matters, and it makes church an actual sanctuary for people, right? Where if nobody else in your life is using your right name and pronouns, here they will do that. So we can be that 4th context. We can make that 1/3 of a difference almost for trans kids, right? The second study is a 2018 study from San Francisco State, and it found that use of the correct pronouns for a non-binary individual made them more likely to seek health care when they required it. And further studies in 2019 and 2020 confirmed that gender-expansive people will avoid interactions with healthcare providers when wrong pronouns have been used. So what does this tell us? Well, one, it tells us something about the importance of right pronouns in healthcare, right? But furthermore, if people will avoid going to the doctor because they're being misgendered, how much more are they going to avoid church if they're being misgendered, right? Church is not, as medically necessary in your day-to-day life, so how much more here, right? So when we think about what welcome and affirmation can look like, we need to be getting people's names and pronouns right. And I know that it's something that it's really easy for us to be like, this is hard. It's easy for us to admit that it's hard, and it's okay to admit that it's hard, but that doesn't mean we get to stop trying, right? And there are lots of ways that we can practice this. So let's talk about what we do when we mess up somebody's name or pronouns. First, don't spend longer apologizing than you spent on the original mistake. I used to work with a guy who would come over to my desk at my cubicle, and he would accidentally use the wrong name or the wrong pronouns for me. He would go back to his desk, and then he'd come back half an hour later and be like, I'm so sorry, I just realized I did that. And he would spend like 20 minutes apologizing to me. It was excruciating. So don't do that. Just apologize quickly. Don't beat yourself up. We all make mistakes. I think the important thing to remember is this is literally, this is about connections and neural networks in your brain, right? You have built a neural connection in your brain to use certain pronouns for somebody, and if they ask you to change, you have to build a new neural connection in your brain. The only way you can create a new neural connection in your brain is, with language, is to say the word out loud, which is why we tell kids to say their flashcards out loud. That makes that neural connection in your brain. So if you are learning new pronouns for somebody, practice in the shower, while you're driving, talking to somebody else, right? Because you have to say it with your mouth in order for your brain to make that new connection. So don't beat yourself up. Your brain's just learning to do a new thing. Ask yourself if there might be some barriers for you in using new pronouns for this person. Are there emotions you need to talk through with somebody? It's okay if there are, right? It's okay to have emotions. Emotions aren't bad things. Sometimes we can get to the point where we say, you know, this is really hard for me, and I just don't know what to do about it anymore, and it's because there's something deeper going on that we need to talk to somebody about. And that's fine. We need to talk to people about these things. If you find that you just keep getting stuck with all this practice, think about the fact that there might be some underlying stuff happening there that could use a little bit of extra TLC. Like I said, practice using the right pronouns. Practice them in places where you're alone or talking with somebody else who knows about these new pronouns. And then don't give up, right? Don't give up, because it can feel hard to do a new thing, and it can be hard to, especially if it's pronouns that you're not familiar with, if you're using they, them pronouns for somebody for the first time, or if you're using any of the neo pronouns like ze, zir. I'll tell you myself, I have trouble with ze, zir pronouns sometimes because I have to teach my brain to do a new thing, right? I'm not automatically better at this just because I'm trans. I have to practice too. But the important thing to remember is, like, imagine how hard it is for you to do that. Imagine how much harder it is to be constantly misgendered every second of every day of your life. So it's sort of a matter of degrees, and we want to put that effort in to support the people when they need it, because we know how much it matters. Okay, some other things we can do. The next one is using inclusive language. I'm sure a lot of you are already doing this already, right? Using inclusive language about God, not only using masculine language about God all the time. Not because it's necessarily wrong, but because when we only imagine God as male, we end up making the male God, right? When we only imagine God in this one specific way, and then we talk about how people are made in God's image, we are, implicitly making masculine identified people closer to God than anyone else. And of course, feminists have been talking about this for literal decades. This is not new. But it's true when we talk about people beyond the gender binary as well. So how do we talk about God in maybe some non-gendered terms, right? And not to say, don't use Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but think about maybe adding in Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Non-gendered terms for God from Augustine, right? That's not new. So thinking about the ways that we use language for God. Thinking about the way we use language about the community, right? Do we talk about brothers and sisters in Christ? Do we address the kids in the room as boys and girls, right? That's not going to work for everybody. And the reason why it's important that we include people in our language is because if we don't, they assume that they can't be called on, they can't come forward, they need to be invisible, right? They can't be involved. So adding in non-gendered language for groups of people is also really important. It doesn't mean you can't say brothers and sisters. It means just say brothers and sisters and siblings. Easy fix. Add one more thing in there, and that will help include everybody in the room. If you, for instance, so let me give you an example of this that is not gender related. I grew up non-denominational, right? And we didn't do infant baptism. So when I joined a Lutheran church in my teens, and I would go to youth group, and the pastor would constantly say, well, we're all baptized here. And I would be sitting there in the back like, don't let them know. Don't tell them I'm not baptized. They'll kick me out, right? That's the feeling we want to not have happen for people, right? When we talk about the people in the room. So, oops. Hold on. There we go. The third one is language and music. This happens a lot where we do like men sing verse 1, women sing verse 2. We can easily change that to high voices and low voices, and it works for everybody, right? And then you don't have to be afraid that if you're singing, and like, I talk with people all the time in church music, like women come up to me and are like, I basically sing the tenor line, and I don't want it to make me feel like less of a woman, right? And I'm like, absolutely, this is helpful for everybody. So moving to something like that will be a helpful move. And then what are we asking people to sing? When they're singing hymns, what theology are we asking them to espouse? What are we asking them to say about themselves, right? So in the original Be Thou My Vision, the line is, Thou my great Father and I thy true Son. For a long time, women were like, I don't love singing about how I'm God's son. That does not seem right. So the Chalice hymnal changed it, right? Eleanor Hull changed it for the Chalice hymnal. And of course, it's difficult when you're dealing with rhyme and meter and all these other things that are inherent in music. But asking people how we can maybe make slight changes to hymns so that we're not asking people to misgender themselves when they sing. I think there's even, I'm trying to think, there's a really classic welcoming hymn that we sing in the Lutheran Church. It's in the ELW. And it's like a great... It's a great hymn about, you know, including all people, but it includes all people by using a bunch of binaries. So it's like black and white, men and women, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, by using all these binaries, we're actually kind of ruining the whole emphasis of the song, right? So we need to think more critically about the language that we're using in songs as well. All right. So let's get on with this big buffet of action items. Here are all kinds of things you could do with continuing education and conversation. Churches need to be continually thinking about this stuff, and I know that we're often worried that churches will be like, all we ever talk about is LGBT things, right? So you do have to mix it up with all the other things your church cares about. But adult ed sessions, helping people understand things like language, right? And how we talk about LGBT people in general. If you are somebody at a church who's like, we want to be affirming, but we have no trans people in our church, that is where you have book groups and movie nights, right? Where you watch documentaries and you read books together from voices in that community that you don't have maybe present in your church. Table talks and panels are great when you bring in folks. Remember to compensate people for telling their stories. That's very important. We don't want people to come in and put their trauma on display for everybody, and it's because we give them a sandwich at the end of the day, right? Sermon talkbacks, including gender diversity in educational curriculum. So, for instance, there's a lot of really great work being done on kids' curriculums for Sunday school through Soul Force. If you know Soul Force, they have a new curriculum for Sunday school. And the UCC is coming out with a new one as well that includes stories like Joseph and his multicolored coat, right? The story of Joseph and his coat is like, has canonically been understood in Christian and Jewish history as a story about like gender diversity, because the thing Joseph is wearing in context is a feminine item of clothing, and we never talk about that. So what happens when we talk with little kids about like Joseph, this kid who liked to wear a thing that was kind of princessy, and like how his brothers were mad at him about that, right? And how do we talk about that with little kids? They're gonna connect with that. If they need to hear that, they're gonna hear it, right? So let's think about the way we include stories like that in our storytelling. Bible studies, small groups, etc. And then the last one on this list, preparing people to engage with anti-trans rhetoric. This is something that I've been going kind of hard on recently because there has been so much anti-trans rhetoric running around, right? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of some misinformation that you may have heard, and I'm going to give you like the smallest soundbite on each of these, because it may be questions like things that you have and that you've heard and you're like, is that true? So we're going to address each of these very quickly. First one, being trans is a mental illness, right? The complicating factor here, if you remember, it used to be that being gay or lesbian used to be in the DSM as a mental illness, right? And then we took that out because we were like, wait a minute, no, it's not. So we took it out. In the DSM now, there's a thing called gender dysphoria, which is essentially the negative experience that you have of when the thing that people expect of you gender-wise and who you know yourself to be go like nails on a chalkboard, right? It's that internal dissonance of knowing you're not what people think you are when it comes to gender. And we have that in the DSM still because it's the only way that trans people can medically transition. The only way you can medically transition is by having a diagnosis. So that's why we have it in there. It's basically to protect doctors and insurance companies, but it doesn't mean that being trans is a mental illness. What we're trying to alleviate is people's distress, but that doesn't mean that being trans is a mental illness, right? Second one, all trans people medically transition. Not true. You can socially transition by changing your name and your hair and the way you dress and your language, all that kind of stuff. You can legally transition by changing your gender marker on your driver's license, things like that. You can do none of the kinds of transition and still be trans. There's no requirement. 3, doctors are doing gender-related surgery on children. This is a big one that people seem to think is happening all over the place, and it's not. No surgery is happening on trans kids. The surgery that is happening is the surgery that is being done on intersex kids, those kids I was talking about earlier, kids that are born with differences in their reproductive anatomy. Oftentimes, surgery is done, they're babies, so they can't consent, right? And sometimes, especially in the past, surgery has been done on infants to make their external reproductive organs look more male or more female without even the parents knowing about it. So this is a thing that we want to stop, right? We don't want anybody to have surgery without their ability to consent and choose for themselves. So surgery on intersex kids, bad, and we want to stop it. No surgery is being done on trans kids. The earliest stuff you can do as a trans person is puberty blockers that start, of course, at puberty, and those are reversible. When you come off of them, puberty starts right back up again. So they're a great thing that has been used for a long time in cisgender kids for precocious puberty, kids that start puberty too early. They're a medically proven way of helping with people with their experiences of puberty. So. 4, tons of people are detransitioning and experience transition regret. About 13% of people who have transitioned at some point have done things to detransition or maybe go off of hormones, for instance. But 85% of those people say it's because of the external negative experiences they're having and pressure from other people, and that they want to continue their transition as soon as they have more support. So even when it's like that number of people, it's very, very small, right? And in terms of surgery regret, less than 2% of trans people who have surgery regret it, which is a wildly low number considering, can you guess the regret rate for knee replacement surgery? 30%. 30% of people who get knee replacement regret it. So it's a very, very low regret rate surgery-wise. Being trans is a social contagion. My kid's just doing it because all the other kids are doing it, right? This was based off a book that came out a little while ago called Irreversible Damage. It's a terrible book. It was basically about how we're rushing girls into transition because we don't want them to be tomboys. And it was based on really, really, really bad science. Basically, the person who wrote this book went to a bunch of parents groups for parents that didn't want their kids to transition and said, were you surprised by your kid's transition? Was this out of the blue for you? Do you like it? And you can guess what they all said. No, because they took a sample from an anti-trans parent group. So the science is really bunk on that. There's no evidence whatsoever that kids are becoming trans because their friends are. The thing that is happening in terms of like why we have so many more trans people coming out now is because they have access to the language younger, right? Because it's like in our society now that we're starting to talk about. If I would have heard about trans people when I was 10, I absolutely would have come out at 10, but I didn't have that language till I was 24. So that's kind of what we're seeing right now, is that it's not like something's in the water. It's that people are finally getting the language to express themselves earlier. Trans people are a danger to children. It's the same thing we said about gay and lesbian folks. It's the exact same playbook, just being rewritten again. And then the thing about sports is weird. Sometimes trans people are too powerful to play sports, and sometimes we're too weak to play sports. There's the argument about how, trans girls shouldn't play sports on girls' sports teams because they're big and tough because they were assigned male at birth. Realistically, that's number one, trans women are not winning at sports. There was a big brouhaha over the last weekend because a trans woman ran a marathon in London, and she came in like 6,000th, and people were mad about it because it like pushed everybody else back one, and she came in like 6,000th, right? When we talk about, especially in high school, trans girls participating in sports in high school, if you are a trans girl who's transitioning in high school, you're taking testosterone suppression medication. That's part of medical transition. And so it's not like you are participating with a whole bunch of testosterone in your body. I have to go every year, all trans people have to go every year to get their blood drawn and check our hormone levels. And the idea is to get our hormone levels as close to cis-level hormone levels as possible. So you're not super steroided up, right? And then what we don't talk about is the fact that the one trans athlete who's kicking everybody's butt is a male wrestler named Max. I forget his last name. What was that? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I cannot remember Max's last name. But he's a trans guy, and he is kicking everybody's butt at wrestling, and nobody's talking about it because they don't want to talk about how this person who is assigned female at birth is kicking all the boys' butts, right? Nobody's worried about kicking Max off the sports team. So it's a whole thing. We didn't punish Michael Phelps for swimming, even though there was all that brouhaha about how his body was like freakishly perfect for swimming and he was born with extra long arms and legs. But we didn't say you can't because you have a biological advantage, right? So there's a lot that can be said about that. So I just want to give you that to kind of start the conversation in your own brain that we need to be talking with folks about this, because it's not enough to just debunk when misinformation comes out. It's also important to do this thing that we call pre-bunking, which is essentially making sure people know what the truth is before they hear things that aren't true. So, important conversations to have. All right, a couple more buffet slides here. Things you can do to share resources. Offer your building space to trans groups, right? There's some really great things happening right now with churches that are like, oh, we have an extra closet in our church that we're not using. We're going to start a clothes closet here where people can come and donate their clothes, and then trans people that are transitioning, who maybe don't want to go buy a whole new wardrobe, can come get all their clothes for free, right? Great building space use. Of course, there's obvious things like offering your building to PFLAG for meetings, right? There's things like that as well. Donating a portion of tithes to local trans organizations and supporting trans people resettling in Minnesota, all great things to do. Advocacy and Pride in Public. It sounds like you're doing a great job being at the Pride Parade and having a booth. Great job, everyone. So being at local events, sharing information about current legislation. Now I know, as churches, we can be very nervous about getting our 501c3 taken away if we say anything around legislation. Telling people that the legislation exists is totally fine to do. To be like, hey, yes, we just passed the trans refuge bill in Minnesota. Great. There are also bills up in the Minnesota legislature that require visual genitalia checks for kids before they can participate in sports. It's not going to pass, thankfully, but we should know that that's a thing that's happening here, right? This is not something that's contained to other states. Writing letters to local media. And this is a thing, not just with writing letters, but in general. It's so important for us as individuals of faith and as faith communities to talk about how our faith compels us to support trans folks. Not just that we're not affirming, or that our faith doesn't play into it. We have to talk about how our faith calls us to be affirming, because there's a lot of people talking about how their faith calls them to not be affirming, right? It is up to us to say, I'm a Christian and that is why I support transgender people, right? Planning programming with local trans orgs. There's a lot of wonderful ones in the Twin Cities. If you have connected at all with the group Tigers in the Twin Cities, those 2 eyes, it's a group for trans parents for parents and their trans kids. And it's a great group. They're a wonderful group of people. And they sometimes need, places to meet, or they need support in other ways. So connecting with organizations and letting them know, like, we're a supportive church and we'd love to help you in whatever way makes sense. And the very last one here is signage, right? And I put that last on purpose. As much as I love the number of churches that are putting up pride flags and things like that, we only do signage like that when we can back it up with action. Because one of the things that so often happens is that a church will be visible about their welcome, but then when people actually walk into the building, people will get misgendered, or there's ways where churches will say that they want to be welcoming, they're living into that wanting to welcome, which is great, but then we haven't done the work behind the scenes to make sure when people actually get here, we have what they need, right? So the reason I put signage last is because we should have all this other stuff that we're working on at the same time as we put that pride flag out, so that we're not just doing the signage and nothing else. So, also important. And then this next slide here is pastoral care, right? Things you can do as somebody maybe in ministry or as somebody who works in a church. Having resource lists in the church office or in your office is so important, right? Resources for very flickery. Resources for trans support hotlines, right? There's an organization called Trans Lifeline that's the only trans-run organization that if you call them, you will get a trans person and you can talk to them. It's really great for folks that need extra support, especially around suicide. Gender-affirming care in your area, places like Family Tree Clinic in the Twin Cities are doing a great job with gender-affirming care, so knowing where you can recommend people. Safe housing in your area, and then support for parents and caregivers. If every pastor could have all those resource lists to know where to connect people to, that would be wonderful. Because the idea here isn't that you need to know everything, it's that you need to know who to ask, right? You don't have to know everything, you just have to know, oh, I don't know about that, but I know this organization might have some resources, right? And then have liturgy available. Preparation for hormone therapy or preparation for surgery, or like I did, the renaming with or without a remembrance of baptism. And then for special days, Trans Day of Remembrance and Trans Day of Visibility especially. So, if you're like, Austen, where do I get information about this kind of stuff? If you go to transmissionministry.com, which is the org I run, there is a resource list. There's one for trans folks, one for family members, and one for pastors and ministry professionals. And that'll get you started on where you can kind of cultivate these lists from. Last 2 slides here are just resource possibilities. The first one is great books on gender diversity. So these 4 are all ones that I recommend highly, especially How to Understand Your Gender. I would love everybody in the country to read that book. It's great for trans and cisgender folks. It's really about how gender works and how it's enculturated in us and how we understand it. And the point of learning more about this is so that you can have better conversations with other people, right? So that when you talk with other people about your experience of gender and your gender story, because we all have one, we have some interesting common language to use. And last one is resources for people in ministry. So these 4 are all really wonderful. The second edition here of Ministry Among God's Queer Folk has some really good stuff about trans folks. The first edition, they didn't get too much into trans people, but the second one they did. Made Known Loved by Ross Murray is the new great manual for youth ministry in general. I just really appreciate all 4 of those books if they're ones that you want to check out for more resources. So that's where I'm going to stop. That's my resource list. So if you want to check out resources, there you go. If you want to check out Transmission Ministry Collective, you can do that there. And we are always looking for more church partners. So let me know if you want to find ways to work together. So that's where I'm going to stop, and we'll do some questions. I know that was a lot. Yeah. Yeah, and if you want to say them, I'll repeat them into the mic so that people can hear. I went to Luther. What was that? Well, it's funny. I have a complicated relationship with Luther, right? I love them and they're my home, and also I want so much better for them. The reason that I went there was specifically when I was looking at seminaries, everybody was telling me I should go to PLTS, Pacific Lutheran Theological, in California. They were like, that's where all the queer theology is happening. That's where you go, right? And I was like, I started talking to people and I said, should I go there? And they were like, here's the thing. I had this one person say to me, here's the thing, go to PLTS if you want to do really great queer theology work, but never have anybody question you or challenge you on any of this stuff, because they've already worked through it, so they are not going to challenge you in that way. If you want to have conversations with people you're going to end up probably having the rest of your life, go to Luther, because you'll be fighting tooth and nail, and then you'll learn how to do that. So it's complicated, but I appreciate what I learned there a lot. Yeah, how did I approach my parents and what was their response? That's almost always the first question I get. So in terms of how I approached my parents ended up splitting up when I was a teenager, and my mom kind of left the church that I had grown up in for a lot of the reasons that I did, honestly. And so with her, it was much more of a issue of her coming to understand what it means to be trans, which took some education, but she's one of those people that she's just give me some books. I'll read a bunch about it and we'll figure it out, right? And I really appreciate that about her. With my dad, he left the church that we grew up in and got more conservative. And so for him, it wasn't just an issue of I don't understand trans people, it was also a theology issue, right? So with him, it's a continual, we're continually working through it to this day, of trying to find ways that we can understand each other better and trying to draw boundaries that will keep both of us safe and healthy. So, we're at a great point now where he uses my right name and pronouns, thank goodness. Nobody else in his family does, but at least he does, and that means a lot. But he's still really struggling with it, and it's, 10 years later. So it's always a work in process. And I think with parents in general, the hard thing is always that when you tell people in your life something that you have been thinking about for years, maybe your whole life, and they are just now hearing it for the first time, you want them to go as fast as you're going, and they're not, they haven't had the time to think about it yet. And that's nobody's fault, right? It's not their fault that they can't move faster, and it's not our fault for wanting them to move faster. So it's one of those things that you just kind of have to keep figuring out ways to find compromise along the way when it is safe and healthy for you to do that. Not everybody has that experience, so. Yeah. Yeah, so similar question about my sisters, and is there a generational difference? My two sisters are wonderful. They have been my supporters from day one. I remember when I first talked to them about it, I said, what do you think, how would you feel about having a brother? And they both were like, what? And I was like, so if I was trans and this was a thing, what would you, and they were just like, oh, that makes sense, so fine. They were very chill about it. And not because, my middle sister is 30, how old am I? My middle sister's 32, my youngest sister's 30. And so it's not that I don't think either of them knows any other trans people, or at least not many. So it's not like they were surrounded by people and just took it in. They just thought it makes sense for Austen, and I love you, so we'll work on it. So the three of us are very close, which I really appreciate. Yeah. Totally. So question about helping grandchildren or young kids in general be open and loving and accepting when they meet people that are maybe gender expansive or expressing their gender in more fluid ways. My favorite thing is always just including lots of children's books that like I read to them. Like I have 2 goddaughters and I have several other young people in my life, and making sure that they have access to books about people that are different from them in like every possible way, right? Because so often I notice them, they connect what's going on with their life with the books that they're reading. So one of my friend's young daughter, she's 1.5, and the books that they read to her, she'll be like, oh, this is just like in my book. And we're like, yeah, it is, you know? And so to be able to say, there are lots of really great kids' books, resources on TMC's website, but to be able to give a kid a book and read them a book about how pink is not just for girls, right? Boys can wear pink and that's okay. And then when they go to school and they come home, they can be like, oh yeah, somebody in my school, you know, a boy in my school was wearing a pink dress today. And it's like not even a big deal because they've already heard about it in a book. So I am a big advocate for children's books, and there's more and more out there now that are great. The book that I want every church library to have is called A Church for All. It's a great book. Yes, I see people flailing in the background. It's called A Church for All. It's a great kids' picture book, and it's just like going through a church Sunday service, but all the people in the congregation are just like the most wildly diverse group of folks, and you get to point to them and be like, look, you know, that person's in a wheelchair, and that person has pink hair, and that person is, you know, like whatever. It's great. So, yeah, kids' books. Big affirmation there. No, fair enough. So wondering about the availability of slides. So Don, what I can do is send you and Susan a PDF version of the ones without all of my personal pictures in them. So yeah, I can send that for sure. Yep. Yeah. Ooh, okay. Everybody go look at the flag on the north side of the church when you leave. Yeah, I'm trying to, so there's a, I wish I could remember this person's name. Shoot. There's a person who has started doing a sort of tweaked version of the Our Whole Lives curriculum. And Our Whole Lives is is it UU or is it UCC? UCC? It's a combo? Okay, yeah. So that's their sort of like young adult, especially around like sex education, like how do we talk about relationships, right? And they've started doing a sort of tweaked version of that includes a lot more about gender diversity, and they're doing it with 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, I think. So I know that I've been part of that with, hold on, it'll come to me. What is the Lutheran church in Roseville that's like, the same, like this, no, not St. Timothy. Oh, shoot. Allie Farron is the pastor there, and I cannot remember the name of the church. But yeah, look up Allie Farron, you'll find it. So that church in Roseville has partnered with Jill Rohde's church in St. Anthony Park, and they do their youth things together with that new curriculum that's kind of tweaked and added to, and it's great. Like I've been a part of it for the last couple of years they've done it, and I highly recommend. So yeah, check with Jill Rohde in St. Louis Park, or St. Anthony Park, and Allie Farron in Roseville. Those two pastors will have more connections. ELCA, yep. Oh, thanks. Oh,
I came to the realization of my true identity relatively late in my life. And my family was wonderful. I have no bad stories to tell about letting friends and family, folks know. They were wonderful. And I want to just share a story from when I told my brother that might give all of you maybe just a little bit more sense of, I don't know. It was about 2 years after I had come out to my brother and sister-in-law, and there was a moment I said, you know, I really want to thank you for the way that you accepted me when I said that. And my brother is very kind of salt of the earth. I still don't get it. And you have to know my brother, first of all, to know that that was not an unwelcoming statement. He was just stating the simple truth. And that's what I want to share, the question of why are you trans? I don't have the first notion of why. I just know that doing the work that I did with professionals helping me through, that it was like a loose thread, and I started pulling. Where is this going to end? I didn't want it to be. I didn't. Until there came to a point where I said, I cannot deny this anymore. And I felt an internal peace that I had never felt before in that moment. But now, in this world, I made myself a target in doing that. And it's so painful right now. A young person I don't know, her memorial service yesterday. She was 20 years old. Her own life as a trans person because the culture we're in right now told her that she was not valuable and she was not worthy and that she was, and that's wrong. That's just wrong. Thank you for listening. I know I'm in a safe place. I came in here. That's important.
thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. I think there's so much pressure to, at the same time, show people that to be trans is not like an inherently tragic thing, that we can have happy, healthy lives. And yet, we have to be very clear about the threat that we're under. Both of those things are true. And I appreciate what your brother said about how he didn't get it yet, because I think as important as education is, which is why I do what I do, our care has to always exceed our understanding. Always. Right. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. So there's going to be a point where your understanding hits a brick wall, but your care can exceed that. You don't have to understand. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. Anything else? Yes, so question about how I originally was like, wait a second, Jewish folks are more affirming. Now, of course, there's many ways of being Jewish, and there are many denominations within Judaism, just as as are within Christianity. But conservative and reform, and so of the four major branches, right, you've got Orthodox, conservative, reform, Reconstructionist, and three of the four are trans-affirming. And of course, they have inter-community discussions about it. Not everybody is 100% on board, but the overall statement of those sort of denominational organizations is that they are trans-affirming. And the reason for that is not because they say, we're throwing out the Bible, but there is two things I think that are big differences. One is the culture of discussion and the culture of holding multiple possibilities of a meaning within many Jewish traditional ways of understanding Scripture is so much stronger. Christianity has a history of saying there's one right way to understand it and we've got it. Judaism has a history of saying there are multiple interpretations of this text and we're not entirely sure which the right one is, but we're going to do our best, right? So that difference in understanding makes a huge difference. The other thing that both conservative and reform traditions, in statements that they've made about trans-affirmation, they have based that affirmation on the belief that the most important thing you can do as a Jewish person is called pikuah nefesh, the saving of a soul or saving of a life. Saving a life overrides all other rules, which means if you are, an Orthodox Jewish person and you don't travel on the Sabbath, right, you can still travel on the Sabbath if you need to get somebody to the hospital, right, because it's the saving of a life that overrides all other rules. And they've decided within conservative and reform traditions that for trans folks, any sort of like affirming care and treating people the way they need to be treated is saving their life. So saving of a life is going to be more important than any other rule that we have. And I wish so much that Christianity had that sense of things. We so often say, it doesn't matter what happens to your body because we're going to heaven. And that's the way we've decided that like heaven is more important than life here on earth. But if we had that same sense of like saving a life and like saving the life of your neighbor is more important than anything else, which I think Jesus probably is pointing to, we would have a lot different tradition today, I think. So yeah, I think those are the two big differences I noticed. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question is, how does... Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So the question is, do I know anything about how Islam is like handles trans affirmation? And the answer is, I don't know enough. I don't know enough to speak to it. I know that there is so much variety, again, within Islam as there is within Judaism, as there is with Christianity. There are more and more organizations that are working on affirmation within Muslim communities. So there's an organization called Muslims for Progressive Values that is like the big, like they work on all kinds of progressive stuff together, including trans affirmation, including LGBTQ affirmation. So if you want to check out Muslims for Progressive Values, they're a huge group that I would look at for resources. And there are more, lots of places like worshiping communities for Muslims are called masjids. And so there's an organization in Chicago called Masjid al-Rabia that is a synagogue run by trans Muslims, or synagogue, sorry. It's not a synagogue, it's a community run by trans Muslims. And so not only are there more Muslim communities that are becoming more affirming, but there are also more religious communities run by LGBTQ Muslims. So yeah, I know that it definitely exists, and I know that there's like work happening in those communities, but I don't know enough about the basis of the theology there to speak to that. Yeah. last question? Oh. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. Yeah. So the question is, what do you do essentially when you have youth that are coming out in your church, but their parents don't know yet or aren't supportive? And I think that speaks to the importance of having multiple layers of support within the church, so that you have, pastors that are willing to meet with the parents, by themselves to talk about their experience with theology, and you need the youth workers that are working with the youth to support them in whatever they need in that context. And it has to be like multiple levels of support to sort of foster that. In terms of like confidentiality and keeping confidences, it's so tricky, and I don't think that there is a one right answer for every situation. I know that in Ross Murray's book, In Made Known Loved, he talks a lot about that, about like what do you do when a kid comes out to you, and how do you keep that confidence and also make sure that you're not transgressing boundaries, right? So I think it's pretty much always a case-by-case basis where that happens, where it's like, when do I talk to anybody else about this? And I just always encourage people that are working in a church context, if you have a person who's like technically above you on the chain of command in the church who you know is affirming, make sure that another adult knows, and like try to keep it so that it's not you being the only one, but also have a conversation with the kid ahead of time to say, thank you so much for telling me. Is it okay if I tell just Pastor Steve about this, because I know that he's going to be affirming, but then that makes sure that we don't have any sort of weird relationship between the two of us, right? So talking with the kid ahead of time to make sure that that's okay with them. So yeah, it's really tough, but definitely check out Ross's work on that, because he's done a lot of good work there. I think that's our time, Don.
Yes, thank you, Austen. Great information, and you'll get information to me about information that was up there. Austen has his newest book available out as you leave. Out as you leave that way. And as you leave, I've been coming in that door and going out the whole time. So as you leave today, we are taking a free will offering, if you are so moved. There's offering plates back there. Do we have anything else to say? Do I have clergy that would like to, one clergy here that would like to pray as we leave? I want to thank everybody for all the food they brought and all the conversation that was going on. It was wonderful to hear it downstairs. And again, Austen, thank you so much once more for Austen. Wonderful information. So I thought Max might be moved to that. So.
The designated extrovert. Austen, thank you for being here. Just your blessing in our midst, and thank you all for being here. As a South Dakota farmer, had to come out professionally in his 50s. I resonate with much of your story. And so I'll close with some good news from Champlin. On May 20th, we are having our first same-gender wedding with yours truly presiding. And to my knowledge, this has never happened in the history of our annual conference. A long way, baby. And Geraldine will be doing music, and these guys are such a blessing. So thank you all for the good work, and keep the faith. We've got more bars. God, Creator, Spirit who unites us and transforms the world. Jesus, our brother, we meet you in this holy space and time. Protect our trans siblings, and may we be the arms that hold them close at all times. In the name of the Holy Three we pray. Amen.
Have a good afternoon.